You may have seen reports that Amnesty International slammed Cyprus in a recent report about the way that migrants here are very often treated like criminals. It's a hard-hitting report, and Georgos Kosmopoulos is in Brussels for Amnesty International. He is the campaigner for Greece, Cyprus, Europe and Central Asia. He's on the line. Georgos, good evening.
Good evening. Thanks for the invitation.
My pleasure. Now, this was a hard-hitting report, but then Amnesty International, I guess, does its homework. How did you find all this information that suggests that literally hundreds of men and women who arrive in Cyprus each year fleeing war and persecution and poverty end up being locked away, and it says in the report, in breach of their international obligations?
Yes, actually we have been monitoring Cyprus for several years, but we decided to come and have a research mission. That's what Amnesty does. We substantiate our claims through recent research missions that, with evidence we collect on the ground, and of course reports from individuals, lawyers and NGOs we receive. So last year we came to Cyprus, we came last December, and we spoke with hundreds of people, hundreds of migrants who were actually detained. We spoke to them in the detention facilities, we spoke to them afterwards, we spoke to people who have been detained, etc. We spoke to authorities, we spoke to NGOs, the office of the ombudsperson, etc. And then we came back again, that was last week actually, 10 days ago, to see what has changed in the situation. So we have concluded that indeed Cyprus is in breach of its international obligations when it's using detention as a tool to regulate immigration.
What you were saying basically is that people who shouldn't be kept behind bars, whether it's in a detention centre or many of them in the central prison, I understand, that this is not something that international law allows for, unless what, they've committed a crime?
Well, let's be clear. In Cyprus, people spend unnecessarily months detained, not because they have committed any crime, but simply while awaiting their documents to be in order to be deported. Well, in what you mentioned is that they are being detained in the Nicosia Central Prison. The Nicosia Central Prison has two specific blocks, yards, where they detain people who are to be deported. So what we found is that the detention is routine, and it's not as a last resort as required by international human rights standards.
All right, and you would have thought that in a place the size of Cyprus it was fairly difficult for people to disappear. So if they're awaiting deportation, can they not be asked to report to a police station every day or something?
Well, exactly. Cyprus authorities have to demonstrate that their detention is indeed necessary. This means that they have to be provided with alternatives to detention. It could be, as you mentioned, a reporting requirement. There are many cases in the international practice that Cyprus can use as an example. But we haven't seen any case like that. Instead, people, as soon as they are declared irregulars or illegals according to their legislation, they're being issued with deportation orders and with detention orders without any examination of alternative measures, as you mentioned.
You said you spoke to the authorities here. Yes. What did they say when you put these points to them?
Well, I think maybe we might have seen that the authorities responded saying that the detention is used as a last resort. But we raised these issues, and they consider that they have the right to do, and they have the right to detain people because they think that there might be a risk of absconding. But as I told you before, risk of absconding or the necessity has to be demonstrated, and it has to be an individual assessment of each specific case. You cannot have a blank policy of detaining everybody.
It's also pretty difficult to abscond from an island.
Well, that is also something we have to consider, but it's not up to us actually to set what is absconding and not, and there are different kind of criteria that have to be applied. But what we have seen is that Cyprus has no policy on that. It doesn't determine what is absconding or when it determines...
No, when I said that, what I meant, Georgos, is the fact we are an island. You want to get off, all right, you could, I suppose, cross the Green Line and go to the occupied areas, but other than that, you have to pass through some sort of passport control at one of the Republic's airports or ports. So it'd be very easy to find people, wouldn't it? So it's impossible for them to abscond, and it seems to me the argument being used for locking them up is that they may disappear. That isn't actually allowed, though, is it?
No, that is not allowed in the sense that you have to demonstrate that there is actually that risk, and it has to be an individual assessment. Maybe one person or two might disappear. There are many ways to disappear. As you said, being an island is a very specific situation. You know, you are surrounded by the sea, and there are specific point of entry exit. But when you are detaining somebody for 3 or 5 months, or 9 or 10 months, as cases we have seen, you are depriving of his liberty, and this is something that the Cypriot authorities have to understand very, very well. You cannot deprive this person.
Can I ask you also about the case of, I believe, several Syrians who are being kept at the moment? Now, my understanding was that it has been decreed, I'm not sure whether it's by the United Nations, that you cannot at the moment deport anybody to Syria for obvious reasons, because there is such a problem there that you wouldn't send people into that situation. So I also was of the understanding that people could only be detained if a deportation order was pending. Now, if you can't deport somebody to a country, why are you detaining them when you know you can't deport them?
Well, exactly. You said it yourself. Actually, a deportation order means a detention is linked to the deportation. Where deportation cannot be affected, then the grounds, the reasons for the detention as such cease to exist, right? And Syrians is a perfectly clear example. We met more than 20 people in Block 10, 20 Syrians detained in Block 10, detained for more than 3 months. The Cypriot authorities told us themselves that they are not deporting people back to Syria, and they shouldn't be deporting, and rightfully so they're not deporting. Therefore, we completely don't understand why are these people being detained? Why are they being deprived of their family life, of their freedom, when this deportation cannot be affected? It's a clear-cut case, and we really cannot understand this policy.
Now, where does all this fit in with European legislation, bearing in mind your report is highly embarrassing, I suggest, literally a couple of weeks before Cyprus takes over the rotating presidency of the European Council?
Well, it has to be clear that the report comes not because Cyprus is taking over the European Council presidency, but because there are human rights violations taking place in Cyprus. And it's also true that all European member states have their own human rights issues. In all countries, we can find issues of concerns for Amnesty International. Now, we don't see a direct link, but we do expect that, for example, we could hope that Cyprus will take this as an opportunity to demonstrate internally its leadership on human rights issue and try to clean up its own house before leading the Europe in such a high level.
The other thing that shocked me about the report was the conditions in which some of these people are being detained. Lack of medical facilities, overcrowding and so on. Can you enlighten us a little bit on that?
Yes, of course. I visited this detention facility several times, well, at least 2 times in the recent past. What can I say? In some of them, there is no access to fresh air. Toilets are dirty and often without doors, and cells are overcrowded, while almost every detainee complained over the lack of adequate medical care. People who are detained there suffer from stress, anxiety, and the situation impacts negatively on their health. You know, we have seen suicide attempts and attempts of self-harming in the past. The conditions need to be urgently improved. This situation is inhumane. Cannot continue detaining people in conditions like that.
And again, you've obviously put these points to the authorities. What's been the reaction and the reply?
Well, we discussed this issue with the former, as we mentioned also in the report, with the previous Minister for Interior. They did mention that they are aware of the situation and they are taking steps to improve them. And they also mentioned that there is going to be a new detention facility in Menoia, which is being constructed. We haven't seen that facility, and I understand it's not operational yet, but here it has to be also made clear that detention has to be a last resort. Even if the conditions up to international standards, detention has to be a last resort, and only after the authorities have demonstrated that it's necessary and other measures, alternatives to detention, less coercive, have been examined and they have been ruled out in the specific situation.
And, I mean, how can you get the authorities to demonstrate that they have done this? Because patently they haven't.
Well, they haven't. I mean, it's pretty clear that they are not doing that. All the detention orders we see, all the deportation orders are accompanied by the detention orders. The law doesn't specify alternative measures. We haven't seen the practice anything. The ombudsperson also agrees with this approach. Well, what has to be done, and maybe we can explain that in a few words so people can understand. When you find somebody irregularly residing in your territory, we don't disagree that Cyprus has the right to order this person to leave the country.
Mm-hmm.
But before resorting to detention, there has to be to offer alternatives to detention. We mentioned some of them. There's no point of going back, such as reporting requirements, etc. It's only then, after they have found that these requirements are not sufficient to achieve the aim, which is the deportation, it's only then that they have the right to proceed to a detention of this person in order to effect this deportation. And I'm saying to effect the deportation because international law and European Union law and now the law of Cyprus is very clear on that. Whenever there is no prospect of deportation or there is no reasonable prospect of deporting somebody, this detention ceases to be legal and people have to be released immediately. So, in a few words, there are steps that have to be taken and the authorities have to demonstrate in each individual case that detention is not necessary. And if you allow me 1 second, I would like to tell you what does it mean for people. We have seen a mother of three children detained for 5 months, told her that her 3-year-old daughter didn't talk to her for weeks, thinking that her mother had abandoned her. Other kids suffered melancholy and stress due to the detention of the parents. People have committed suicide attempts. This is real people we are talking about, and detention has a devastating effect on their lives and the lives of their families. That we should always keep in mind.
Yes, I mean, it has a knock-on effect, doesn't it, for all the people around. What about the asylum seekers who have to wait so long for their papers to be processed to determine whether or not they will be granted asylum? Am I right in thinking that some of them are also detained while that procedure is going on?
Yes, we have had cases of asylum seekers being detained. Now, again, refugee law, international law, is very clear on that. Detention of asylum seekers, because of their inherent vulnerability, you understand people flee very, very dangerous situations, detention has to be avoided. It has to be only in exceptional circumstances. But we have seen cases where detention took place for asylum seekers while the examination of their claim was pending. And this, we think, again, it contravenes international law and the obligations of Cyprus.
Because it could be that their application will be approved.
It could be that their application could be approved, and there has to be a fair asylum system in place to examine that claim. But regardless of their application to be approved or not, I mean, there are safeguards there to make sure that no one who is entitled to international protection, as means, doesn't suffer because of that. You know, so even in the cases where it should be approved, will be approved or not being approved, the safeguards are there to make sure everybody has a fair examination and people are not put into stress for no reason. And again, even if because I heard this argument, like I heard it from the authorities, I heard it from people in Cyprus, that some people abuse the system. You know, people, liberty, it's a very, very important thing. You have to safeguard it and respect it. This has to be clear.
And it's obvious from the report that you feel it isn't clear in Cyprus. Tell me whether or not you've got mixed messages from the different organisations. I mean, I presume there's the welfare department, there's the asylum service, there's the migration department. There are lots of different government arms, as it were, dealing with these issues. Are they coordinated?
Well, I mean, there are several departments, but this is not specific to Cyprus. We've seen many countries have same structures. Well, I'm really not in a position to judge whether they are cooperating or not. I feel they should be cooperating. They should be there in order to support these people, in order to facilitate the processes. But I have to say, though, that even though our report doesn't go into the asylum determination procedure, it focuses around the detention of asylum seekers and irregular migrants. We did get several complaints by detained people, asylum seekers or rejected asylum seekers, or irregular migrants that they complain over the treatment of the authorities. But again, I cannot pass any judgment because we haven't had a thorough investigation of this. But
The other issue, Georgos, is of course the access to some sort of legal aid. Now, I don't know how other countries do it. I know that in the UK, I think it's much easier to get legal aid. What is the situation in Cyprus if somebody who has been detained wants to fight that detention?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because it's a very big concern of ours. We have seen, I will break it down in 2 points. One is, as you said, the lack of free legal aid. It's impossible for someone to navigate through this system of legal aid, this system of detention and deportation without having free legal aid. Most of the migrants, or many of the migrants, don't have the means to pay for a lawyer. So international standards require, international standards and European Union law, that for those people who cannot afford to pay for a lawyer, to put it more simply, this support has to exist there. Unfortunately, Cyprus has recently enacted some legislation around that, but we're still not satisfied because it's very, very limited, and in practice it has no effect because most of the people cannot access this free legal aid. But let me say...
Do they know about it in the first instance?
No, they don't know, and this is where I wanted to get, because it's one thing having it, but when we visited the detention facilities, for example, we didn't see material informing them. Most of the people didn't know, and it was mainly by chance, or only those who could pay for a lawyer that could actually have access to a lawyer. But even for those people who managed somehow to take their cases to the court, the Supreme Court in several cases has found that their detention unlawful because of its length and has ordered their immediate release. Instead, these people were rearrested on the spot, sometimes inside the building of the Supreme Court.
On what charge?
Well, they're still considered as irregular migrants, and they were taken directly back to their detention center, meaning that even in cases where people managed to get access to the court, these are not respected on the ground. So we're really concerned about this, and it's really up to the minister to make sure that this is not happening anymore.
And, can anything else be done about this, apart from obviously informing the relevant people of their rights and of any access they should have to legal aid? It does seem a bit pointless if, having gone through the procedure with the legal aid, they're then rearrested. What do they have to do, go back to court again, several months later?
Well...
it sounds like a vicious circle.
Because, it's a situation where you cannot get out of it. And I have to say also that most of the cases were taken to the court, to the Supreme Court, the ones we are mentioning, were taken because some lawyers wanted to work pro bono, so they did not receive money to do that. Some others received, but this also goes to show what does it mean to have or not to have money. But the Cyprus legislation is clear on that. It's the minister who has the responsibility to enforce these decisions.
Can I just ask you as well, Georgos, whether or not there are any sort of international conventions on the actual applications for asylum? There are some countries where I think it's fairly clear that if that's where you come from, then the chances are you cannot be sent back. And if you ask for asylum, in most countries it would be granted. Have you got any figures for Cyprus as to whether or not we're about average with other countries in applications which are approved?
Well, the applications in Cyprus, the rate of the international recognition awarded is extremely low. It has been extremely low in the past and continues to be. It's below European Union average, and actually it has to be among the lowest in the European Union. Now, in the past, and that also has to be said, that Cyprus has received a fairly large amount of applications. Mm-hmm. Compared to per capita, it has been one of the countries who has received the most. But here again, these applications are now, according to the authorities, like the volume is now completely manageable, so this is not an excuse. But
sorry, it shouldn't have any bearing on the legality of somebody's application,
exactly.
Whether you get 1 or 400 applications.
Exactly. That's where I wanted to get. States have the responsibility to offer protections to these people. They have to be prepared. They have to have the systems in place, and where necessary, they have to ask for international solidarity. And now it's the European Union who might be able to step in and help these people. So there's no way that somebody can be sent back to a place where he or she might face persecution, death, or torture. This is something we cannot accept, and we have to make sure that this doesn't happen.
When are you coming back for Amnesty to see whether or not any changes have been made following on from both your meetings twice this year and this report?
Well, we don't have exact plans yet. I think we'll continue our discussion with the authorities to see what we can achieve, and we'll be really glad to come back before the end of the year and monitor the situation further. We do expect that we'll engage with authorities in a constructive dialogue, that we'll just have to find solutions, and it's up to the authorities to start moving forward. We don't expect that there is going to be a magic wand that will change anything, but we do want to see progress.
Some movement, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And we might be very, very critical, as you said, but we're also very, very supportive when we see genuine interest and words come to practice, to actions.